Hello and welcome to Alden Caro's Poetry Podcast. I'm Alden Caro, poet, walker and author of Cumbria in verse, Lakes to Fells in poetry. This is a podcast for people who suspect, as I do, that the world is moving too quickly and that something quietly extraordinary waits for anyone willing to slow down, listen closely and pay proper attention to it. In every episode, I share two poems. The first is a guest poem from the wider world of verse, something that has stayed with me, or troubled me, or refused to let me go. The second is one of my own, drawn from the fells, the coast, the weather, and the strange beauty of ordinary days. And for your chance to win a signed copy of Cumbria in verse, Lakes to Fells in poetry, I invite you to suggest a future guest poem by emailing me at aldencaro78@gmail.com. That's aldencaro78@gmail.com. The next guest poem will come from one of you. My email address is in the episode description. Today we are climbing. This week's walk follows a stretch of road so steep that locals gave up describing it and just called it the struggle, which tells you exactly what to expect before we've even taken a single step. We begin in 1836 on a Yorkshire moor in a gathering storm with an 18-year-old poet who does not run for shelter. Emily Brontë writes herself directly into the weather breaking over her and finds something closer to freedom than fear inside it. Then we climb into Cumbria, onto a 1 in 4 gradient cut through 400 million years of volcanic stone, where boots have worn the steps smooth and nothing can put down root until, without warning, the climb ends, the ground falls away, and the whole sky opens at once. So, pour something warm, settle in, the wind is up, the light is going, and there is poetry to be found. Before we go any further, I want to put our theme plainly, because everything this week hangs from it. It begins as strain, it ends as breath. I want you to hold on to that, because we're going to test it twice this week, first on a moor and then on a mountain road, and I think it holds both times. Now this week, for the first time in a good while, our guest poem comes from a woman, and I will admit that it's overdue. Emily Brontë wrote nearly 200 poems in her short life, most of them never intended for anyone's eyes but her own. She kept them in small, private notebooks, and it was only when her sister Charlotte discovered one that the family realised what had been written in the room next door all along. The three sisters published a joint collection under male pseudonyms in 1846. Emily wrote as Ellis Bell, and it sold, by one account, only 2 copies. Charlotte later wrote that Emily was genuinely angry when the notebook was found, as though something private had been taken from her without permission, and it took her sisters days to talk her into publishing it all. Many of her poems, this one included, sit somewhere between private diary and an invented saga called Gondel, a fictional world she and her youngest sister Anne had been building since childhood, which makes the raw, unguarded voice in these lines even more striking, since she never expected a stranger to hear it. She is remembered now, almost entirely, for one extraordinary novel written in the year before her death, Wuthering Heights. But the poems came first, and I think they explain the novel more than the novel explains them. Emily Brontë grew up at Haworth Parsonage, on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, not so very far as the crow flies, from where I'm sitting to write this. She was known, even by her own family, as the one who needed the moor, the way other people need company. She walked it alone for hours, in weather that sent everyone else indoors, and by every account she came back from those walks not diminished but restored. High Waving Heather was written in 1836 when she was 18, and it reads exactly like what it probably was, a poem written during a storm, or immediately after one, by someone who had just stood inside the storm on purpose. What strikes me most is the poem's opening move. She doesn't describe the storm as something happening to the landscape while she watches from safety. She describes a spirit, her own, we can assume, being sent away from its dreary dungeon with the storm doing the sending. The weather is not the threat here. The weather is the release. Listen for how quickly the poem moves from bending heather to bursting bars. There is almost no distance between the two at all. Here is Emily Brontë's High Waving Heather. High waving heather, 'neath stormy blasts bending, midnight and moonlight and bright shining stars, darkness and glory rejoicingly blending, earth rising to heaven and heaven descending, man's spirit away from its drear dungeon sending, bursting the fetters and breaking the bars. All down the mountainsides wild forests lending one mighty voice to the life-giving wind, rivers their banks in the jubilee rending, fast through the valleys a reckless course wending, wider and deeper their waters extending, leaving a desolate desert behind. Shining and lowering and swelling and dying, changing forever from midnight to noon, roaring like thunder, like soft music sighing, shadows on shadows advancing and flying, lightning bright flashes the deep gloom defying, coming as swiftly and fading as soon. I want to sit with that poem for a moment before we move on, because I think it's doing something unusual for a poem about weather. Most nature poetry about a storm positions the speaker as a witness, awed, perhaps frightened, watching something vast and indifferent from a place of relative safety. Brontë does the opposite. There is no distance in this poem at all. By the second line, she's already dissolved the boundary between herself and the storm entirely, earth rising to heaven, heaven descending, her own spirit breaking out of what she calls its drear dungeon at exactly the moment the weather turns violent. The storm doesn't threaten her freedom, it is her freedom arriving. That's a genuinely strange thing to feel about a storm, and I don't think it's naive. Brontë was 18 when she wrote this, and by every account she already knew this more intimately, its danger as well as its beauty. She wasn't a stranger romanticising a landscape she had only glimpsed from a train window. She had walked it in exactly this weather, alone, for hours, and come back changed rather than harmed. What she's describing, I think, is not the absence of strain, but a particular relationship to it. The storm bends the heather nearly flat, and the heather's aliveness is located precisely in that bending, not in some sheltered version of itself that never had to. I keep coming back to that word, bending, not breaking, not really resisting either, just bending all the way over and springing back up once the wind allows it. There's a lesson in that for anyone who writes, I think, beyond the specific subject of storms and moors. The poems we write, most honestly, are rarely the ones polished with an audience already in mind. They are the ones written the way this one apparently was, quickly, privately, with no thoughts that anyone else would ever read them. Something in that absence of an audience seemed to let the real voice through undefended. That's the exact shape I want to carry into this week's poem of my own, because Kirkstone Pass tests the same idea on entirely different ground. Not heather in a storm, but a road cut straight up the side of a mountain, where the strain is not weather but gradient, and the release is not a storm passing but a summit arriving. Same shape, different material entirely. Kirkstone Pass sits at the top of the A592, the road that connects Ambleside to Patterdale, and at 454 metres above sea level, it's the highest road pass in the Lake District that motor traffic still crosses. The climb up from Ambleside has a local name, and it's not a scenic one. Walkers and cyclists alike call it the Struggle, a name earned honestly, because the gradient really does reach 1 in 4 in places, exactly as the poem states, not as poetic exaggeration, but as an actual measurement on an actual road sign. The pass takes its name from a standing stone a little further along, near the summit, the Kirkstone itself, whose silhouette is said to resemble a church steeple, kirk being the old word for church. For centuries before it was a road at all, this was a drover's route. Farmers driving cattle over the fell between valleys, which is worth remembering every time the tarmac feels like the only thing that has ever been here. It wasn't. It's simply the newest layer. The rock underfoot is genuinely as old as the poem claims. Volcanic stone from the Borrowdale volcanic group, laid down something like 450 million years ago, when this part of England was closer to a chain of active volcanoes than to anything resembling a fell. Quarrymen once worked a seam of distinctive green slate near the summit, stone found almost nowhere else in Britain, and hauled it down the same gradient that now empties tourist hire cars of their brake fluid. Near the top, the Kirkstone Pass Inn has stood, in one form or another, since 1496, one of the highest inhabited buildings in England, and proof that people have always needed somewhere to stop and recover once the worst of the climb is behind them. Records for the building go back to a local monastery, which means the same instinct, climb, then shelter, then climb again, has been built into this exact stretch of ground for over 500 years. I wrote this poem after driving it in mists, when the crest arrived so suddenly it felt less like reaching a summit than falling through a door. Here is my poem, Kirkstone Pass. The gradient tightens to a 1 in 4 strain, where the road binds the volcanic flank. Gravity drags the scree in a slow descent toward the valley floor, scoured by ice. At the saddle, the world contracts to a line. Dry stone walls brace against the heavy fell. Grey slate compressed 400 million years, now a jagged edge. The rising mist collapses distance to a single step. Water cuts the peat in thin silver veins, finding the deep ruts worn down to bedrock. Where boots have polished the stone steps, the mineral sediment pools in the dark. A fine silt of passage and constant rain. No trees can root in this scouring air, only the low-lying moss and short stems of heather hugging the grit. The wind sweeps the asphalt clean, refusing the accumulation of soil. Beyond the crest, the land falls away in a rush, releasing the eye into a sudden breadth. The tarmac is a scar, a thin human mark on the weathered ground, leading the body out of the cramped ascent and into the open cold. And now on to our discussion this week. I want to borrow a phrase directly from this week's road, because I don't think I could improve on it. Locals don't call the climb from Ambleside anything clever. They call it the struggle, and that, more than any writing craft metaphor I could invent, is exactly what the middle of a difficult poem feels like. Every poem I have ever finished has had a stretch like this somewhere in its draft, usually not at the beginning, when the first image arrives with its own energy, and not at the end, when the shape is already visible and finishing. It feels almost like transcription. It's the middle that resists. You know roughly where you are going. You don't yet know how to get there, and every line you try feels like it is grinding against the gradient rather than climbing it. Here is what I've learned slowly about that stretch. First, the gradient is not a sign that the poem is wrong. It's very tempting, somewhere in the middle of a hard draft, to conclude that the resistance you are feeling is the poem itself telling you to stop, that a poem which arrived easily would have kept arriving easily throughout. I don't think that's true, and Kirkstone Pass is a fairly literal argument against it. Nobody who has driven up the struggle has ever taken the gradient as a sign they are on the wrong road. The gradient is simply what the correct road costs in this particular stretch, and knowing that in advance changes how it feels to be inside it. Second, work in the smallest units you can manage. On a 1 in 4 gradient, nobody thinks about the summit. You think about the next 20 feet of tarmac, and then the additional 20 after that. Applied to a stanza that will not resolve, this means abandoning temporarily any thought of the poem's ending, and asking only what the next single line needs to do. I have thrown away entire middle stanzas, written under summit pressure, trying to write the ending's weight into the middle's lines, and kept, almost without exception, the stanzas written while I was only thinking about the next 20 feet. Third, and this is the one that took me longest to trust, the crest rarely announces itself in advance. Kirkstone's summit famously arrives without warning, especially in mist. The gradient simply stops, and the whole sky is suddenly there. Drafts behave the same way more often than we admit. More often, you are still grinding through a stanza that refuses to work, and then, often on a walk, often nowhere near the desk, the line that unlocks the whole thing simply arrives, and you realise afterwards that you were closer to the top than the effort had led you to believe. I will say honestly that this poem had exactly this stretch. The opening 5 lines arrived almost whole in the car before I had even parked. The closing image of the crest opening onto breadth arrived just as fast, days later on a different visit entirely. Everything in between, the walls, the water in the peat, the boots polishing stone, took 3 drafts and the best part of 2 weeks. And for most of that period, I was fairly convinced the middle simply didn't want to exist. It did. It was only ever the struggle doing what struggles do. So if you are inside a draft that feels like nothing but strain right now, with no sense of a summit anywhere in sight, I would offer you the same advice I would give anyone driving the struggle for the first time. Don't judge the gradient by how it feels at the steepest point. Keep the wheels moving. The crest doesn't care how it felt getting there, and neither in the end will you. And so we come to the end of another walk together. We have stood on a Yorkshire moor with an 18-year-old poet who found her freedom inside a storm rather than in shelter from it. And we have climbed a 1 in 4 gradient, cut through 400 million years of volcanic stone, where the strain does not ease gradually but simply ends, all at once in a sudden view. 2 poems about the same shape, arrived at from opposite directions, heather that survives by bending all the way over, and a road that only makes sense once you have climbed the whole of it. And the truth that runs underneath both. It begins as strain, it ends as breadth. Now, before I let you go, one more thing, because I'm too excited about it to hold back any longer. The next volume in this series, Somerset in Verse, Ex Morta Levels in Poetry, is finished and will be available in paperback on Amazon from the 3rd of September this year. There are no pre-orders, you will simply be able to find it on the day. Somerset turned out to be some of the richest ground this series has crossed. It's a county built on the arguments between water and land, a 12-metre tide that resets the coastline twice a day, peat closing slowly over a Neolithic trackway, rivers pumped uphill against their own weight just to keep the fields dry. From the red sandstone spine of Exmoor to the drowned clay of the levels, every poem in this collection is about something holding its ground against odds that are, quite literally, geological. I will have much more on Somerset in verse in the weeks ahead. For now, just remember the date, the 3rd of September 2026, and know that it's coming. Before I go, one small thing, and I promise it will stay small, because this is not that kind of show. If these walks are becoming part of your week, the surest way not to lose them is to follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening now. It's free, it's quiet, and it means the next episode finds its own way to you every Wednesday morning without you having to remember. If the show has given you something, following it is the simplest way to make sure it keeps doing so, and it helps other quiet souls out there searching for exactly this to find their way here too. And now it's on to our competition. If there is a poem you would like featured in a future episode, a classic, something modern, or a personal favourite you have carried with you for years, please email me at oldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's oldencarrow78@gmail.com. Every suggestion is entered into the draw for a signed copy of Cumbria in verse, Lakes to Fells in poetry, which will be sent to you by hand. The book is also available to buy at Amazon. The next guest poem will come from one of you, and that is precisely how I want this podcast to work. Not a summit that only rewards whoever arrives first, but a gradient climbed one small step at a time by whoever keeps choosing to take the next one. So thank you for listening, for slowing down with me, and for being willing to keep climbing, even though the stretch that feels like nothing but strain, because the breath, when it comes, tends to arrive exactly when you have stopped watching for it. Until next time, may you find poetry waiting for you in the everyday, and I shall speak to you again on Wednesday.